Welcome to WarPod, a podcast brought to you by Saferworld, asking experts from around the world about the impact of security policy on contemporary conflict. 24th of December 2024 marks the 10-year anniversary of the entry into force of the Arms Trade Treaty, or ATT. Today, we're going to talk about the ATT, reflecting on what the treaty is, what led to its adoption, and where it's going in the future. I'm Charlie Linney, Project Coordinator at Saferworld, and today I'm joined by my two colleagues, Roy Isbister and Liz Kirkham, who between them have decades of experience working on arms transfer control issues, including specifically on the Arms Trade Treaty. So, Roy, can you open by telling us a bit about what the ATT actually is and how does it work in practice?
So the Arms Trade Treaty is a global, legally binding treaty that sets out the rules for when states can or cannot transfer arms across borders. And it's conventional arms, so that we're talking about from an individual ammunition round from a pistol right up to a fighter aircraft or an aircraft carrier. It's only conventional arms. We're not talking about biological, nuclear, chemical weapons. And these are all weapons that are considered legitimate. And so we're not talking about a prohibition, as we might be, for example, for anti-personnel landmines and for biological weapons. But we're talking about the regulation, when it is okay to transfer and when it is not okay to transfer.
There's also a formal ATT process, which comprises a number of working groups which meet once or twice every year. There are 3 working groups, one focusing on treaty implementation, one focusing on transparency and reporting, and one focusing on universalisation. And these working groups deliberate over a variety of topics and then present their findings in a report to the annual Conference of States Parties, which is the big showpiece event at the end of each annual CSP cycle. And the Conference of States Parties is chaired by a rotating president, usually from different regions of the world in succession.
That's useful. I think that's really good context for the discussion. So now, taking a step back, could you tell us a bit about how the ATT came about? How was it adopted? What process led to it being adopted? And what was Saferworld's involvement in that?
The origins of the ATT lie in the campaign for an EU Code of Conduct on arms exports, which was initiated by a small group of NGOs, including Saferworld, in the early 1990s. And from about 1992 to 1997, we joined with European partners to build support for the EU Code across Europe. And in 1998, the UK government decided to push for an EU Code of Conduct, taking advantage of its presidency of the European Council at that time. So yes, the EU Code of Conduct was agreed, and this inspired people around the world to think about what other contexts you could introduce regulation of international arms transfers. And one of the most notable developments was the involvement of Oscar Arias, who's former president of Costa Rica and Nobel laureate. And he gathered together a commission of Nobel laureates to support an international code of conduct. It was a very good initiative in terms that it raised the profile of this type of agreement on the international stage. But unfortunately, it didn't really gain much traction with governments. So the NGOs involved in supporting this initiative, including Saferworld, Amnesty and the Arias Foundation, we got together and thought carefully about, what our next steps would be. And we took advice from international lawyers, and we basically decided that we needed to work towards a legally binding international treaty. So what we did was we distilled out the existing legal norms from the international code and also built on that with existing international law and developed something which was initially called the Framework Convention on International Arms Transfers. It's not the snappiest of titles, but I would say that the content and the structure of the Framework Convention bears a very close resemblance to that of the ATT that currently exists.
Maybe it's just worth mentioning something about that name. And on one level, this may sound quite trivial, but in talking to governments and taking this to parliamentarians and to media and so on, the Framework Convention on International Arms Transfers became shortened to the Framework Convention, which became a minor problem in itself, because what is a Framework Convention? What's it about? There's nothing in that title to tell you what you're talking about. And so I remember in meetings with the fellow NGOs, etc., constantly banging on about we need to change the name so that people understand immediately what you're talking about. And there was a meeting where this was picked up, and someone in that meeting said, well, why don't we call it the Arms Trade Treaty? And that's where the name comes from, just that little moment. But what may seem trivial became a larger issue in the negotiations later down the track, because the word trade became a source of contention. Some states, probably most notably China, then argued that this whole idea only applied to commercial transactions, the commercial trade in arms. So any kind of gifts, any government-to-government deals would stand outside the treaty. So it's just interesting, I think, to see that what can be decided in a moment and seems of no consequence can actually be a bigger issue in the field of international negotiations, where language can become very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. So Liz, what were the next steps after that?
Okay, so what was now called the Arms Trade Treaty was still an NGO campaign. We were joined by a range of other organisations, including Oxfam, and together the big NGOs launched a campaign called the Control Arms Campaign, which Saferworld was also a part of. And that was really significant in moving the dial in terms of government support for the treaty. In the early stages of the Arms Trade Treaty's life, we had, I think, 3 main sponsors for quite a while, and that was Mali, Cambodia and Costa Rica. The Control Arms campaign really helped move things along and give more international profile to the initiative. But the real step change was when the UK government decided that they were going to support the Arms Trade Treaty and support negotiation of a treaty through the UN. And what they did was they came to Saferworld and they asked us if we would be willing to host an event to do with arms transfers, in which the Foreign Secretary could attend, who was Jack Straw at the time, and he would be able to make the announcement that the UK government were going to put its weight behind an arms trade treaty. And so that happened, and in late 2006, the first resolution was passed at the UN General Assembly, and this had the support of not only the UK but 6 other countries representing different regions of the world. So it was quite a clever move on their part, because it immediately gave the ATT a kind of global feel, a global sort of conception, and it made it possible to move on. So that first resolution was the first step in a UN process that ultimately led to formal negotiations in 2012 and 2013.
To my mind, that was actually very quick. Once the ATT entered the UN process, I anticipated a much longer process to ultimately get to when an ATT would be agreed, if it would be agreed at all. So we got there very quickly, though once we got to that kind of formal negotiation stage, which started with a conference in 2012, it wasn't plain sailing. For a good portion of that conference, it felt like we might actually get an ATT at that point. But on the final morning, suddenly the US said, no, we cannot support this. There are things in this draft that we cannot support. So that's a flat no. And this was a consensus-based process, so it required the support of all UN member states. So when the US said no, that killed it off for that moment. But what did happen is it got thrown to a further conference in 2013. And that actually, in hindsight, was a useful maneuver, because what came out of the 2013 conference was probably, I think, a stronger document, a stronger treaty than what existed at the end of the 2012 point. But the issue of consensus still reared its head, because we had 3 states at the end that were basically saying no to the treaty, and that was Iran, Syria and North Korea. And I would actually take the view that if Iran, North Korea and Syria had supported that draft, it would have suggested there were some serious problems with the draft, given the role that they play in the kind of international environment. So I remember speaking to states saying, well, we're back where we were before. We've got states saying no, so where do we go? But the answer to that was, well, if the US says no, that means something. If North Korea says no, that means a different thing. And what actually happened was, okay, the conference couldn't agree, but then the draft was flipped into the General Assembly, because the conference was a separate standalone process. The treaty was flipped into the UN General Assembly, where it could go through on a vote. And that's what happened. It was voted through in 2013. Having said all that, the consensus process means that there's a lot of compromise in any negotiation of this type. So the treaty that we had was not the treaty that Saferworld would have liked to have seen. There is a lot of compromise in there. So, for example, the scope of the treaty, that is the equipment that the treaty applies to, is much narrower, or certainly narrower than we would have liked to see. So it covers the whole range of conventional arms, but it's restricted to the more kind of obvious weapons and weapons platforms, and there's a lot of military equipment that supports military activity, which, if you want to take a very literal and minimalistic approach to the treaty, stands outside what the treaty covers.
It's absolutely fascinating to hear that level of detail from people who were there right at the start. And I think some of those points that you touched on at the end there lead us really nicely into my next question, which is about the fact that, as I said at the start of the recording, 2024 marks the 10-year anniversary of the ATT's entry into force. What do you see as the main successes that we've seen over the past 10 years, and what have been the main challenges or roadblocks?
On successes, I think if you'd asked me 10 years ago how many states parties would there be in the treaty at 10 years down the road. We've got, I think it's 116 now. I think that's a higher number than I would have anticipated. So it has been supported by a broad swathe of the international community to a greater extent than I thought was probably likely. So that's very positive. There's also, at the national level, part of what the treaty does is it requires states to build a national system so that they actually regulate the arms that are crossing their border, coming into or going into the country or going out. And a surprising number of countries just simply didn't have this in place. So it's been very useful in actually getting countries to be able to take control of arms at the border. And we've done a lot of work on this, working with individual states to analyse what their current system is, how that compares to what's required under the Arms Trade Treaty, and then to help plug that gap and build the systems that mean that they can actually do what's required by the ATT. So I think those are a couple of examples of very positive changes. Depending on the context, we see cases where there might be conflict or there might be significant armed violence, where states parties as a whole do seem to be honouring their commitments, their obligations under the treaty, and not flooding the zone with arms, with not supplying arms into those contexts. So Sudan would be an example at the moment. Arms are finding their way there, but for the most part, I think states parties, for the most part, their hands are pretty clean. We do have cases where we see problematic behaviour by states parties, though, and that seems to be where they are identifying what they see or they perceive as a major national interest, a national security interest, or maybe a significant economic interest in supporting a party to a conflict. And a couple of recent examples are the support for countries that made up the Saudi and UAE-led coalition in the war in Yemen. And more recently, we've seen problematic behaviour with arms exports to Israel, given what's been going on with Gaza and now with Lebanon over the last year or so. And that's where we see some very significant countries that have been involved. And we've mentioned before about the really positive role that the UK has played historically on the Arms Trade Treaty, but now we see it being a very problematic actor in terms of the exports that it's continued to authorise to Saudi Arabia right through the Yemen conflict, and now with continuing to supply arms to Israel, given what's going on in Gaza and in the region.
So in terms of problematic transfers, there's another issue here, and that concerns the role of signatory states. Signatory states are states that have signed but not ratified the ATT. And basically, whereas states parties are required to follow every single binding provision within the treaty, signatory states are merely required to not undermine the object and purpose of the treaty, which is basically the core objectives of the treaty, which include preventing human suffering. But unfortunately, we have seen over the last few years signatory states increasingly involved in problematic transfers to some very, very bad situations, including the Gaza situation and also Sudan and Libya as well. And there have been a number of signatory states to the ATT who have been involved in transfers into these contexts. And that is a real challenge for the treaty. What exactly are these states bound to do? It's yet to be really explored or agreed upon. But that's something that I think we really need to think hard about.
And the United States is an interesting case here, because we know the US has never ratified the Arms Trade Treaty. It's certainly played a role as the treaty has progressed. A couple of years ago, very early on in the first Trump administration, Trump unsigned, in inverted commas, the Arms Trade Treaty. What does that mean, and what kind of grey area does that throw up for the ATT?
In international legal terms, there is no way of unsigning a treaty. So that was more, for show, or a demonstration of the US distancing themselves from the treaty. And in that regard, they have done that. The US representatives who've attended the conferences of states parties, etc., have done so as observers. And they don't really take an active role in certainly the decision-making around the treaty. So it does put them in a difficult position. It is an anomalous position almost, that they are there, but they're a signatory, but in name only. Obviously, with the second Trump presidency imminent, I think we can see a further distancing from the ATT, which is a bad thing for the treaty, because the US is a contributor in terms of funds for the operation of the treaty. And even as an observer, when the US speaks, people tend to listen. So, they can be a force for good, notwithstanding the questionable arms transfers that the US is undertaking in various contexts.
So one of the things that's coming out here in terms of a key challenge at the moment for the Arms Trade Treaty seems to be this issue of problematic transfers and states potentially going against the spirit, if not the object and purpose of the treaty itself. What are the implications of that for the functioning of the ATT?
Unfortunately, I think as Roy mentioned earlier, there is no enforcement mechanism associated with the treaty. So basically, states can only hold each other to account. And civil society, we try to as well. But fundamentally, the treaty belongs to the states, and the states will or will not hold each other to account as they see fit. And the only way they can really do that is by having discussions within the context of the Conference of States Parties or the working groups that precede that every year, and having discussions about problematic arms transfers into human rights crisis zones and conflict zones. And that really hasn't happened in any meaningful way, or any systematic way, certainly. But it is something that I think could potentially take place going forward. For example, at the most recent Conference of States Parties, the chair of the working group on effective treaty implementation, who's ambassador from Costa Rica, he basically put in his report that he thought there should still be discussions on different contexts where arms transfers are potentially contributing to violations of international law. And that actually made it into the final report from the conference. So as of CSP 10, the states parties have agreed that this is something that is worth doing going forward. So we're very much hoping that that will come into being, and that we will have much more frank and honest discussions about the viability and the desirability of arms transfers in certain situations.
Maybe just to pick up on that and what we see as some of the frustrations with how the formal process is working. We've, quite a number of years ago, actually set up an informal ATT expert group process, which is bringing together representatives from states, but also from civil society and from regional or international organizations to talk about important arms trade treaty related issues, but maybe the issues that the formal process isn't willing to grapple with. And so just to push the envelope a bit with the idea that we can bring that conversation back into the formal process and therefore move the agenda forward. And so that's the kind of thing that we can bring into the conversation through the work that we're doing there.
Can you give us some examples of the specific topics that you've covered in the expert group discussions that are adding value to the discussions happening in the formal ATT process?
So we've looked at things like, for example, how the arms trade treaty should be applied to issues such as transnational organised crime and terrorism. We've looked at specific geographical contexts such as Ukraine, Myanmar, Ethiopia, and how the ATT should be applied in those situations. That's certainly getting into the nitty-gritty in a way that the formal process so far hasn't done.
So now if we look ahead to the next 10 years of the ATT, how do you see all of these developments moving forwards? Where would you like to see the ATT in the next 10 years, for example, or beyond?
Well, I think if you were to ask that question to most people involved in the ATT process, they would say that universalisation is one of the key objectives. I think people won't be happy until all states are parties to the ATT, but I think that's probably some way off. But there are still states out there who are signatories, who haven't yet ratified, and there are other states who didn't sign when they had the opportunity, but now perhaps can be drawn into the ATT process and are beginning to see the benefits that other states are reaping from being part of the ATT. So there is hope in that regard, and it is a priority for each president coming in each year to focus on the issue of universalisation. That's a particular thing that they are required to do. And there are parts of the world where the ATT is very well represented, in Europe, Latin America and West Africa, for example. But then in East Africa, Asia Pacific, the Middle East and North Africa, there are hardly any parties and only very few signatories to the ATT in those areas, in those regions. The challenge is to get out to some of these hard-to-reach countries and hard-to-reach regions and to really kind of try and sell the benefits of joining the ATT insofar as it helps build capacity and, bolster national security through controlling things like your own borders to prevent illicit arms trafficking, etc. So that's definitely a priority. But I would say, though, it's often said that universalisation and implementation are two sides of the same coin. And until we have a situation where existing states parties and signatories are living up to their obligations through their arms transfer policy and practice, until we have that situation, states outside are going to be looking and thinking, is it really worth it? Do we really need to join? It doesn't seem to be working optimally. So we need a big step up in terms of implementation by states parties and signatories. And basically that will hopefully encourage more states to come on board.
So we've spoken a bit here about universalisation and expanding the treaty to include more states. And if we look at the states parties that are currently part of the ATT, there are definitely some major or at least significant arms exporting states that are not represented there. And so I wonder, do you see that as an existential threat to the ATT in terms of its future ability to function and continue to do what it's supposed to do?
It's not just arms exporters, there's arms importers as well. And yes, the universalisation is or complete universalisation would be the ultimate goal. But any state that is joining the treaty needs to be ready to join in terms of its behaviour and its intention. And there are examples out there. Russia, for example, I think if Russia were to join the treaty today, that would do more to undermine the treaty than it would do to reinforce it. So this is a process that takes place over time. It's taken 10 years so far, and it goes on. And hopefully in another 10 years' time, we'll be that much closer to universalisation, but it will be universalisation with implementation.
And what do you see as the role of civil society in supporting universalisation?
Well, civil society has a big role to play in universalisation. In fact, it's probably the thing that civil society is most active in, sort of engaging with their own governments, within their own sub-regions and wider regions, raising the issue of the ATT in all different contexts, discussions, academic, NGO, multilateral discussions where NGOs are able to be present. So civil society is very much committed to the universalisation of the treaty. So we at Saferworld are working with organisations in different parts of the world in order to encourage states to join the ATT and also to implement it in the spirit and to the letter.
I think that's a really important point. Flipping to you, Roy, what would you like to see out of the next 10 years of the ATT? What are your priorities?
First of all, just to pick up on the last thing that Liz was talking about there, because I think there is an acknowledgement from states of the role that civil society plays. It's referenced in the treaty itself, and states continually refer to the need for civil society engagement and involvement, and they applaud the work that we do. However, the funding environment at the moment is very, very difficult, and so it's all very well for states to say that they want and support and applaud civil society engagement. But without states actually providing financial funding support, then it's becoming more and more difficult for civil society to engage and to play that role. But if we're talking about coming back to the fundamentals of the treaty, the big issue is the willingness of states to actually examine how the treaty is being implemented, what transfers are taking place that shouldn't, also what transfers are taking place that should, but there needs to be a concentration on this over the next few years. And Liz was referring to the reference in the report of the last Conference of States Parties, and that kind of builds on the back of the beginning of a conversation at the last CSP process about arms transfers to Palestine. So this was put on the agenda for the first time. The quality of that conversation was disappointing, and states were clearly nervous about going into this kind of subject. But this is what needs to happen in future. So basically, if we're talking about where we are in 10 years' time, what I would like to see is a concentration on looking at transfers that are causing human suffering, that are resulting in violations of international law, that are not in the spirit or the letter of the treaty, and so that states can start to change their practice so that they are implementing the treaty appropriately.
I think that's a really important point to end on and underscores the urgency of this conversation. But that's all we've got time for today. Thank you both for joining me. And if anyone wants to find out more about Saferworld's work on effective arms control, there's lots of information available on our website. Thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Warpod from Saferworld. This series was produced by Andy O'Connor and supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. You can listen to all previous episodes and catch up on the latest releases wherever you get your podcasts by searching for and following Warpod. You can also find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, @war_pod and @Saferworld. And to find out more about our work, visit saferworld-global.org.